Okay, everybody, good afternoon, and welcome to the school board's afternoon work session on community schools. I'll be co-leading this with my colleague, Elaine Tolan. And so before we begin, I want to first welcome our county partners who are joining us here today. So we have with us Jesse Ellis, and we have Chris Leonard, who is our Deputy County Executive. And we also have Principal of Whitman Middle School, Craig Herring. And so we appreciate the three of you coming to help us walk through this information on community schools framework. I did want to just share with my colleagues that I had a number of conversations with our chair of the board and also other board members. So for county staff, I just wanted to let you know kind of where we are mindset-wise. We understand you're going to present this information, and the board certainly wants to then take this information and digest it a little deeper. But also, we really need to have our superintendent and deputy superintendent working with the team to also provide the board with some additional insights and analysis. So this is going to be, I hope, what we see as a very important, crucial step in community schools. But also setting some expectation, because as you can imagine, board members, we've had a lot on our plate, and it was concerning to think, okay, we've got 2 hours to suddenly green light a really big and important step. So with that, I will turn it over to Sloan. Are you moderating for the team, or is Francis okay? Excellent. So again, Francis, if you will take us through. And board members, again, yes, this is informational stage at this point, but it's really going to be important as you are hearing this information to think about any questions that you may have that you want the superintendent and his team to help provide greater clarity. And I especially want to invite Jesse Ellis and Chris Leonard to please present from the county's perspective where you guys are as well. That's going to be important. Thanks.
So thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, and we're very pleased to share with you today an overview and information about the work of the Successful Children and Youth Policy Team, known as Skipt, which is a partnership between Fairfax County government and Fairfax County Public Schools. In addition to Mr. Leonard and Mr. Ellis, who are here, I also would like to introduce Deb Scott, who is our intervention and prevention specialist, Mary Jo Davis, who is our coordinator for social work services, and they've worked very hard on this initiative. Of course, we've mentioned Craig Herring, and Dr. Boyd, who is here in spirit and has also worked on it but couldn't be here today. And so Dr. Presidio and I are representing her as well. And so okay, so as Ms. McLaughlin said, really the purpose today is to provide an overview of the Skipt and also to deepen your understanding regarding the development of a framework for the community schools. And really the purpose is for discussion and feedback, not for decision making. And so I think that's critical as you listen to the details about the framework that's going to be presented. But before we talk about community schools, we wanted to just spend a minute or two on Skipt. And Skipt really started in 2013. And it recognizes that if we are to have a community where all children and youth thrive and reach their full potential, then it will take a collective partnership of the Fairfax community to ensure all children, youth and families and communities have equitable access to quality services and support. So Skipt really provides policy and resource guidance. It's not a decision-making body. Of course, the Board of Supervisors and the school board does that, but it has been instrumental in providing guidance to many key initiatives over the years since it started in 2013. Currently, there are 36 members of Skipt listed, and they're listed in the appendix document that we provided for you. And you'll see that they are elected officials, senior leaders of both Fairfax County government and Fairfax County schools. Some of the shared outcomes are listed there. I'm not going to read them all to you, but the focus really is on health and school readiness, academic success, and workforce readiness. And the goal is to ensure that all disparities are identified and eliminated, whether those are race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, geography, or any other circumstance. The priorities this year, there are 5 that we are working on. 3 that have been multi-year priorities are school readiness, behavioral health, and community schools. And again, we're going to give you that whole journey and story and framework today. And then 2 new ones this year are workforce readiness, workforce development, and My Brother's Keeper, which is we are looking to establish Fairfax County as a My Brother's Keeper community using collective impact approach to improve outcomes for boys and young men of color. I won't go into great depth around some of the milestones of Skipt since it started, but some of those include the school readiness plan, Healthy Minds Fairfax, the Equitable School Readiness Strategic Plan, also the School Attendance Action Plan, as well as in 2016, the School Board and Board of Supervisors jointly adopting the One Fairfax Equity Resolution that arose out of Skipt's effort. And here recently, the 2022, the endorsement of the framework that provides guidance for implementing community schools in Fairfax County. So I'm now going to turn it over to Jesse, who's going to take us back and walk us through the steps of the community schools efforts with Skipt.
Great, thank you. And it's nice to see everybody. For those who I haven't had the chance to meet, I'm Jesse Ellis. I'm the prevention manager in the county's Department of Neighborhood and Community Services, and I am the staff coordinator of the Skipt. You also have, as a handout, the document called Guidance for Implementing Community Schools in Fairfax County, what we refer to as the framework, the Community Schools Framework. And that framework was developed by a committee of the Skipt that really mirrored Skipt's collective impact approach, where we had representatives not only from the school system and various county agencies, but also community-based partners and leaders. After a multi-year journey, that framework was endorsed by the Skipt last spring. Spring of 2021. Again, as Dr. Harvey said, the Skipt is not a policy-making body, right? So it doesn't mean that this is what's in place. It means that it is the framework that is recommended by this broad coalition of the Skipt. The guidance is based on national models of community schools, best practices that have been identified and promoted through the Coalition for Community Schools, which is in the national advocacy and best practices type of organization for this. We did site visits and meetings with staff from local community schools and funders, plus our own experience having launched and implemented now 3 community schools in Fairfax County. We know, I don't need to convince anybody here that for kids to do well, even if we focus solely on academic success, it's about more than what happens in the classroom. We need to ensure that kids have access to supports and opportunities in all phases of their life, and a big piece of that is making sure they have access to the kinds of programs and services that are provided not just through schools, but through the county, through community-based organizations and a variety of kinds of partners and stakeholders. And we know that a place-based approach, when you focus that access on making it physically easy for people to get to, is a best practice way to do that. And community schools is one proven method for helping support kids in that kind of holistic manner. We've seen local bodies, whether it is the FCPS's Minority Student Achievement Oversight Committee, or on the county government side, the Chairman McKay's Task Force on Equity and Opportunity, have all recommended community schools as a promising approach in the past. Thanks. So what is a community school? If you're not familiar with it, it is not a different kind of school. It is our traditional schools that bring in this kind of work, that take this kind of approach. The defining factor that you usually see is, or really that you see everywhere, is a site coordinator, so a full-time position. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But what happens at each school and the kinds of services and programs and opportunities they bring in is really reflective of that individual school's and that individual community's needs and opportunities. But what we see across all successful community schools are what the Coalition for Community Schools has identified as the 4 pillars of community schools, and that's integrated student supports, expanded and enriched learning time and opportunities, active family and community engagement, and collaborative leadership and practices. So those are the 4 common elements. When that's all coordinated and managed by a site coordinator, that's how we basically define a community school. Community schools have been around for quite a while. They might be called different things in different places, but they all share those basic elements. A few years ago, the coalition worked with some others, and they reviewed 143 different studies and evaluations of community schools nationwide that consistently showed that when well implemented and when having those 4 pillars, community schools are effective at improving individual outcomes and meeting students' needs. We, in the appendix, there are links to additional studies and evaluations if you are interested. So let's talk a little bit about the work that the Skipt has done. Back in 2016, some of you were there was a joint school board, Board of Supervisors retreat at the library at Mount Vernon, at which time the boards identified a number of joint priorities, including identifying community hubs, and this is the quote, community hubs or schools with wraparound services. The Skipt took on ownership of that priority and established a community schools committee in early 2017. We fairly quickly connected with the Coalition for Community Schools. They had members even attending our meetings and obviously providing a lot of resources and help as we were looking at what makes a community school and how could we bring that initiative here. We worked with the coalition and with United Way of the National Capital Area, which is funding a lot of community schools in the DMV. And they helped us to visit sites in Montgomery County, in DC, and in Arlington. We sent a pretty large contingent to the National Community Schools Forum, which was in Baltimore in 2018. Ms. McLaughlin came with us. And that's the annual conference that's hosted by the coalition. Mary Jo Davis reminded me earlier that the following year we actually sent a smaller number of staff to a conference up in New York, which was focused on communities that are kind of new to this. we were making pretty good progress in coming up with some broad recommendations for how we could proceed with this, when in 2018, United Way approached FCPS and the county jointly, because they wanted to launch a community school in Fairfax County. And we took that opportunity, and that's when we were able to launch the site at Whitman. We were able to leverage a little bit of funding from United Way and some more funding from the county side to, pretty much at the same time, just maybe a couple months later, launched the site at Mount Vernon Woods. The following year, in 2019, just before the pandemic hit, the organization Communities in Schools approached FCPS about launching a site at Glasgow Middle School. So we actually have 3 different community schools operating in Fairfax. And we built on that experience to be able to further develop our recommendations and finalize them, and then culminating in last June when the Skipt endorsed that set of recommendations. And it became clear, though, I mean, it was clear all along, we wanted to make sure we were also engaging FCPS leadership, both administrative leadership and the board, to address any issues or concerns that you all had, and make sure that this was something that would be able to be implemented effectively. In the guidance document, in the framework, there's about 10 different sections, key components, that are, I'm not going to go through all of them here today. We're going to cover a few of the key ones. But want you to note it's not a full set of policies and procedures or standard operating procedures or anything like that. It is the high level. This is what community schools we believe should look like in Fairfax County. These are the kinds of things they should focus on. This is how they work with the schools and the school system. This is what that collaborative leadership looks like. This is not organized by those same 4 pillars that we talked about, but they are all present. They are all present here. I also want to highlight the guidance is intended to be fairly flexible, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward, but it really is designed to recognize that different schools and communities have different needs, and that there may be slightly different ways in going about how you would implement community schools, even when you have the same general framework. Let me just talk about some of these key components. First is that the key principles driving community schools is nothing that you haven't seen before. We're focusing on equity. We're focusing on a whole child approach. Again, that emphasis of improving access through location, the emphasis on community needs, family and community engagement, and that shared accountability among partners. The basic model, as I've described before, is really one of having that full-time staff person at the site on this, as a part of the school team, really seen as part of the leadership of the school, and working with the school, with community, with county government, with other partners to identify needs and strengths and establish strategies, bring in partners, bring in programs, services, and other kinds of opportunities to achieve the goals that we want. So what are the goals of community schools? We have identified a set of, every time I have to count, it's 7 different outcomes. And this is what you see in the left-hand column here. We added the other columns to show alignment with some other key initiatives and best practices. First is that these outcomes, school attendance, academic performance, student behavior, student health and resilience, school readiness, family stability and engagement, and student connectedness, are aligned with the outcomes of our Opportunity Neighborhoods initiative. If you're not familiar with Opportunity Neighborhoods, this is our place-based approach to improving outcomes for children and youth in Fairfax County. The county government and the schools and community-based partners work really closely in 5 identified neighborhoods to do this work, to focus attention and efforts and opportunities within a specific community. So that's like one step up from community schools. Community schools are at a school level. Opportunity neighborhood is a little bit broader, but you can see this aligns very closely with that. It also aligns with the skipped outcomes that we mentioned earlier, and it aligns with the outcomes that we tend to see nationally. And so the Coalition for Community Schools has identified their best practices, and they've listed what they call results areas. And you can see they align very closely with what we have. So those are the goals, those are the outcomes, what we're trying to achieve. The way we do that is through a set of types of programs and services. And we've organized those along 4 program areas. Family and community engagement, which includes things like parent and family education and awareness, but also active community engagement and leadership. The second is connected and motivated youth. So those are the enrichment activities that you saw reflected in those 4 pillars. The third is school readiness and early childhood services, because we believe that even regardless of the level of school, that by engaging with families and communities, we can help ensure that the kids enter school ready to succeed. And the fourth is family wellness and stability. And so those are support services, those are health services, things like that. Again, these align with what we call our focal areas and opportunity neighborhoods. They also align with the Virginia Community Schools framework, what they call branches of support. And about 2 years ago, it was early in the pandemic, I believe, Virginia Department of Education created their own framework for community schools. And you can see the alignment here, also the alignment nationally with the Coalition for Community Schools. You can see neither the state nor nationally do they mention the school readiness type of programs and services, but we do believe that's so critical and so important here in Fairfax that we really want to highlight it, ensure it's a part. We'll talk a little bit about how community schools get implemented. Some of the questions we most often get are, what school level are these best at? Is it elementary, middle, high school? You can make an argument for any of those. Again, this is where we have flexibility in our framework, where we don't define it should be one or the other, but the same model would apply at whichever level you want. Here on this slide, we have a list of a dozen or so what we think are comparable communities that have community schools initiatives. And you can see most of them are at a variety of school levels. The trend that we are seeing is toward a pipeline approach, where you would include a school and its feeder school or schools. The federal Department of Education in their community school grant program is really looking for those kind of matched schools to be as far as what communities propose. The United Way, National Capital Area, which has been focused primarily on funding middle schools, is now looking to expand that and include primarily high schools that those middle schools feed into, again, creating that pipeline. We also looked at whether that site coordinator position is employed by the school, the local government, or a community-based organization. Most of these are employing CBO, it's a CBO that's employing that staff person, but you also see in some locations where it is the school. I think LA County was the only example we had where it was actually the county government that provided that. Again, we think it could be any of those, and so our guidance, our framework does not recommend one or the other. The final component we want to highlight is how sites get selected. And I want to be really clear that when we're talking about the current sites that we have, both as far as this process goes, how we select sites, but also everything else that we've talked about, these sites were established prior to us developing this. And again, this is not something that's in place, right? Or this is not something that's in place, right? So that's what we're hoping to get at. So I just want to be clear about that we understand that not all sites were selected going through this process. But what we are recommending is an annual process where there's a staff committee, staff of county and FCPS, that are looking at first creating a list of schools based on FRM data, building capacity, because it's really hard to do a community school if you're already at 110% of capacity. And also building renovation plans, because if there's a school that's scheduled to be renovated in the near future, it gives you a really good opportunity to build community school elements into that design. We would then do an initial prioritization of that list based on some academic, community, and service level indicators. Those are listed in here in the site selection section. We'd then be looking at some qualitative type of indicators, such as school and community readiness, geographic access, and other opportunities and barriers that may exist in a community that would either further or hinder a school's ability to have a successful community school. We would then go into a phase of external feedback, and I just mean external to that small committee that would be developing that initial list. We'd want to talk with the schools on the list. That would actually help us with some of those additional considerations. Also make sure that schools are aware and begin to be prepared for this opportunity if it arises. We also want to get feedback from you, the school board, and from the Board of Supervisors. And I think that'll probably be part of our conversation. We would want to know what you think that feedback process, how that could best work. We would then finalize that list, and it would be a public list. And part of the reason is that if, for example, grant opportunities or other sudden funding opportunities become available where we could implement a community school, we'd want to know ahead of time, these are the schools we'd be going to. It would be a prioritized list. We wouldn't always necessarily start with the top one, because it maybe there's a funding opportunity from a funder that is focused on the southern part of the county, right? Or that's only focused on middle schools. And so if an elementary school in the northern part of the county is at the top of the list, we might go to the next one. But that would be the process for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Presidio.
All right, well, thank you so much, Jesse. And I do just want to point out again what an amazing partner Jesse has been on the Community Schools Initiative, but really all things Skipt. You know, I've been fortunate to serve on the Skipt team at different points in time over the years, and I'm now on the executive committee, and he does so much work behind the scenes to organize everything, plan everything, and he is a tremendous partner and asset, and we really appreciate all of his work and his leadership and his collaboration. So we're going to get to board discussion here in just 1 second, but we did want to just provide a little bit more information on kind of the current state of where we're at with community schools in Fairfax. So as Jesse said, of course, we have 3 different community schools. He talked about the timeline that they emerged. And he also talked a little bit about the funding source and the organization, coordinating organization. But just to hit that one more time, I think it's important to point out that when we implemented these programs, we did not have the framework that Jesse just reviewed, and these were really opportunities for us to do some things that were good for students and families in those particular communities. We're grateful for the partnership, of course, with the United Way, and certainly for the partnership with our communities in schools of Northern Virginia. So we wanted to highlight just very quickly a few of the great things that are happening across these different schools. At Mount Vernon Woods, of course, you can see, you know, there's a lot of alignment to those outcome measures that Jesse talked about, supporting students with academic readiness, school readiness, and that's not just early childhood education learning opportunities, but the whole child approach to making sure that students come to school ready to learn, meeting meaning that, their basic needs are met, that they have food security, they have housing security, and really trying to provide those wraparound support services to students and families, particularly at the youngest ages. And then providing a lot of additional academic support, so after-school activities and programs where students can get additional support and services. And then, of course, the partnership with parents is a big piece of the work in communities, in our community schools. And you can see the parenting classes at Mount Vernon Woods certainly is one of the key components there. At Glasgow, that's a different organizing and funding source, but very similar in terms of the services. A lot of work also happening around social-emotional supports, and we talked a lot about that in our earlier work session today. But again, those connections with parents being incredibly important. So I know it's hard to get the sense of what's happening from just looking at a PowerPoint slide. So we asked Dr. Herring to come with us today and just talk a little bit about what this work really looks like in one of our schools. So we'll turn it over to Dr. Herring.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I want to echo Jesse's support in the county. Has been a great partnership. So when you see a list of things from a school, I don't think it gives the big picture. It's kind of hard to wrap your brain around what it feels like to be in a community school. And so as I reflected on it, really 3 things came to mind. The first is that when we became a community school and we had a dedicated site director, we were able to expand services. So it wasn't just trying to get a social worker who already has a full caseload to try to also coordinate a backpack food for weekends with the students, or holiday meals, or getting health services, but having another partner to dedicate that to, we were able to expand. So a lot of our programs went from serving 50 students to 150 students. We were able to really expand upon some existing things and bring in some newer things. I think the second thing that I noticed is we had a strong mentor program at Whitman when I first got there in 2015, and that lead counselor retired. And when that lead counselor retired, all the history and knowledge and sustainability happened to go away, and it was really hard to keep that program going, whereas now we have someone who can dedicate themselves. So instead of 30 mentors lined up with kids, we have over 100. So again, that expandability and sustainability, it'll keep going. The final thing is just the amazing access to community sources. Having a partner like United Way of National Capital Area has provided us to partner with Amazon Web Services we got about 800 backpacks and supplies. We have access to STEM programming. They partnered us with Airbus down in DC. We brought STEM in the schoolyard. We've brought enrichment that impact all the students in the school, maybe not those students we always think about would be best served. It really is just amazing. And additionally, partnering with United Community, they have allowed us to directly connect families to services down in our part of Fairfax County. So those are the 3 things that stand out to me: expansion of services, sustainability, and then just access to partners, more and more partners. Thank you.
That's great, and thanks again for being here. I'm sure that there'll be some questions from board members for you as well. So just as we wrap up here, excuse me, slides right. One of the big things with this initiative that we know that we need to do, it's a growth area for us, is really thinking about measuring impact. And that's been difficult because we haven't had a framework that's been adopted, and we've got different organizing associations with different outcomes. But as Jesse mentioned, we have large categories of outcome data that we can start to collect information around already. And I won't read these to you here, but you can see that we are collecting quantitative impact. So we've got a couple different examples here of the impact around academic supports for students, discipline supports for students, where almost 100% of the students that are participating in those services are seeing an increased impact in a positive trend direction for those folks. As well as you can see the large number of families that are served by some of the wraparound services, whether it's health-related services like vaccinations, or whether it's food insecurity services as well. So we're in the process right now of building out a comprehensive evaluation plan. The Community Schools Committee has done some really good work to outline what that would look like in terms of very measurable quantitative outcomes associated with those big areas that Jesse mentioned earlier. Again, school readiness, academic performance, and social emotional support and performance as well. So we're in the process of building that out. Our FCPS Office of Research and Strategic Improvement is going to do some work with us to make sure that we have a good and valid research methodology as we build out that program evaluation. But right now, that's something that's still a work in progress for us. So what we'd like to do next is open it up for board discussion. And certainly the board can go any direction that you would like to in the discussion, but there are a few areas in particular that the Skipt team would be very interested in receiving feedback around. So if there is any feedback that you have on the community schools framework, things that you like about that framework that you think are essential, things that you maybe think need to be emphasized more or that might be missing, it would be really helpful, because once we build this out, we're going to be aligning all of our decision-making really to that framework. And then lastly, if there's feedback that you have about the site selection process, we know that we're not making any final decisions about that today, but establishing that site selection process is critical because, as Jesse mentioned, we've initiated the 3 schools that we have now because community organizations and funders have come to us with an opportunity, and we need to be able to move and be pretty agile with making our decisions. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Tolan.
Great, thank you so much to everybody and all the information you provided. Before we get started, and I do have 4 board members so far who've signaled a desire to speak and ask questions. I will say to staff that I think it's important to emphasize that while we've done these 3 pilots, which have come by the good fortune of our community-based organizations coming and saying, we are interested in piloting a program, we're going to bring funding dollars to do this. One of the things that Ms. Tolan and I talked about with staff is that as the 10th largest school system, there is nothing that stops us once we determine as a shared county going in this direction of community schools that FCPS is just as capable and the county government to get grant funding and do all the things that a third-party community-based organization is doing. So I think that Principal Herring, you brought up a great point about their network and other outside services, but I think that part wasn't really captured, and I want to make sure my colleagues understand that this is the pilot. This is what we've done, and it's enabled us while we're doing so many other things. But that's why I think there's going to need to be a deeper conversation because we run our own after-school childcare programs. We don't run it through a community-based organization. So there are models here that I think will end up needing greater conversation between the county government and the schools and then the 2 boards. But for now, this was very detailed, very helpful. So I'm going to go with Ms. Keys-Gamarra. You're first on the list, followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders, then Dr. Anderson, and then Ms. Domish.
Thank you. I really do appreciate this presentation today and the opportunity to talk about some of the topics that have been mentioned, the framework and site selection process. So I'll start by looking a little bit into how we gather information. I know we've had the Skipt committee for quite some time. But with respect to site selection, I don't recall this board getting any I don't recall an opportunity to give any feedback into how these existing sites have been selected. So that would be my first concern. I would add on to that is I didn't hear you say how the community has been able to participate in the process of giving feedback. For example, have we had meetings convenient to working parents who are in these communities so that they can give us feedback? So that's my first concern regarding site selection, is what input have we gotten? I know the board has not, we have 2 board members I know on the committee, but in general, in terms of actually finalizing the decision, I don't recall having that opportunity.
Ms. Keys-Gamarra, I do want to just touch on that first before staff answers, because other than Jesse and Chris Leonard, I'm about the only one who was around when that happened. And the school board members were not consulted. The Skipt as a whole wasn't consulted. It was these outside community-based organizations approached the county government, and then there was some internal conversations based on they had a site they were interested in. So I'll tee it up now for whether, Jesse, you remember the history beyond that, but I know that we were sat in a meeting and both of us board members were surprised that we didn't know. And we weren't consulted, so we didn't consult the rest of the board because we weren't consulted either.
I wasn't blaming anybody. I just wanted to have a conversation.
Yeah, I can say that the first sites really arose out of immediate opportunities, and it was kind of as a result of that we realized we needed to come up with a plan, not just for how we select sites, but also what that communication process looks like, and that is detailed in here now as well. I think it's fair to say we definitely didn't do a very good job of engaging everybody that needed to be engaged when those first ones were selected. But we're hoping to move, and if there are further opportunities now, we would certainly be using, even before before the guidance or the framework is put into place, we would certainly be using that communication process if there were new sites.
I'll just add that that is really why this framework and how it has evolved, because there have been a few opportunities, but we wanted to just wait and make sure that everybody understood and was a part of developing the criteria of how we select and then developing really how we will evaluate the outcomes.
Are we getting, I had a question, and this shouldn't count against me because I'm repeating, so give me my seconds back, please. But I asked about how we've gotten communication from people within the communities. Have we not had that opportunity at all up until now? And especially working parents that would.
At a individual school site where we have the sites, and Dr. Herring can probably provide more information, but there are opportunities like that. At the kind of policy developing the framework level, the Skipt is quite representative, includes family members on it, includes community members from various multiple sectors. The committee itself included
Is that a
folks from-
daytime meeting, evening meeting?
We mostly met during the day, but we, again, have quite, this was the working committee. So, but what happens at an individual site, I don't know if you want to talk about how any of that looks.
I don't know if this is the question you're asking, but every fall I do send out a survey to all students, parents, faculty, and it does not go to the community at large. So I do collect information from parents and staff members and students on what they feel like the needs of the school are for the year, and that's how we build out our plan for the year.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember on that. I believe we did send we sent something out when we were under consideration for that.
Thank you. So with respect to the criteria for evaluating, I was thinking more along the lines of One Fairfax, right? In my planning commissioner days, where you're not just looking, of course you're focused on academic excellence and student achievement, but you're also looking at what's available in that community, right? And just thinking of what we just learned from this morning's session, 42% of students needing support with respect to reading. How is that a community initiative, right? Are there libraries available? Are there places where families can be built and have opportunities and access to parks? Is this part of that analysis? And if not, I'd like to propose that it should be.
Yeah, and so that's a big piece, especially in that kind of additional considerations component, where we really look at what kinds of opportunities are there. And this is another place where we have a lot of flexibility, because on one hand, you could say this is a great site for a community school because we have all of these institutions and services right here. On the other hand, you could look and say this is a great site for a community school because those kinds of things aren't easily accessible, so we can find ways to bring them into the school or otherwise provide alternative ways to access those. So there's not an easy measure for those, but things like that are definitely part of the consideration as we're building those prioritized lists of sites.
Well, for example, when I've worked in other counties, they do a lot of co-location, but they're thinking schools, libraries, parks, all in the same area. And so it seems, I agree with you, certainly we should be looking at this one Fairfax matter and, what's available even in environmental learning. How do we support parents? I'm hoping that there is a gathering of both county resources and FCPS resources to create greater learning opportunities and achieve student success. So, with respect to the 42% I just noticed from this, we talked about this morning, our libraries would be very much a part of addressing those this summer, hopefully, as we support our students. So I'd like to see more collaboration beyond just the social services aspect that I think I'm hearing this morning. What is the whole community bringing to the enhancement of the learning experience?
Thank you, Ms. Keys-Gamarra. I really appreciate the answers staff have given. Is there anything else you need before I move to the next person?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you, though.
Excellent, okay.
I feel like we're having a dinner.
Yeah, Ms. Corbett Sanders, followed by Dr. Anderson.
So thank you, and I will need to go back, I'm sure. First, I have to tell you I'm disappointed. I cannot tell you how upset I am that this was preliminarily discussed with the board members in Mount Vernon and Lee over a year ago, and at that time, both of us raised concerns over the fact that the two community schools that had been established initially were established without any consultation or even a heads up to either one of the school board members. And then there were no measurable objectives that were put in place to determine the effectiveness of those schools. I have utmost esteem for the leadership in the schools, but there is not, the question is this success a product of the excellent leadership, or is it a success because you had an external partner working with you? And that's why I asked you, Craig, didn't you do that consultation ahead of time? The second is there's no crosswalk between the work here in this plan, which, by the way, I see was adopted by the Skipt in June of 2021 and was not shared with this board until last Friday night for a discussion at the end of a long weekend on Tuesday. I don't think that that was fair to this board, and I certainly don't believe that this board, it is premature for us to be talking about site selection processes until we have a better understanding of where we're at on the whole process and the approach to community schools. I have concerns over the distinguishing or delineation between the role of a school board and the role of an external organization in the coordination of activities within a school. And so I'd like to understand that. There's also additional questions I have on the mapping between the role of Title I and how Title I schools have an obligation for engaging in the community. Second is poverty is one piece, but accessibility is another. It is not lost on me that one of our community schools today is actually in a community in which every child is bused to that school. And you look at other schools in that area where I've got kids who pass 2 schools to get to the school they attend. And so there is a piece here which is you can't call it a community if you've got people busing that far. And so how do you actually get the families engaged in a community when in a school when they're so far away from the school? Additionally, I'd like to understand a little bit more about the accountability. And then one last piece, I see the My Brother's Keeper as part of Skipt, and I'm glad for that. However, I am understanding that this year in particular, we're seeing significant challenges, not only, actually with girl-on-girl issues. And so I'd like to hear something about that as well, and please put me on a go back.
Thank
Anybody
you.
want to comment?
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Corbett Sanders, absolutely. I do think that it would probably be helpful, maybe for everyone to give a little more detail about how we landed with Whitman Middle School, because as Ms. Corbett Sanders was saying, when we envision the best practice of a community school, it's so that it's not just the student, but truly it's a community school where the families and the people in the community can access vital county and government resources. And so when a site selection occurs where that's not where the community is. I think that was part of your question. Am I
That's
correct?
one of them. I've got about 6 that I embedded in there, and I'd like to hear a little more, starting with.
So what I would do, Ms. Corbett Sanders, because that was 3 packed minutes, I will indulge, or ask my colleagues to indulge this, just go through, ask the question, then get the answer.
First one, why are we seeing this now when it was endorsed in June of 2021? Why did it take so long?
So I think it was a matter of just us scheduling it. And while it was endorsed and presented in June of '21, we have been focused on other areas. So we put a pause on any future selection or moving forward with additional schools until we had an opportunity to bring it and have this discussion with the board.
I would have said 2 weeks ago you could have sent it and we could have read it. Second is the quantifiable metrics of how do you, if you're actually putting something in place, you should have those metrics ahead of time so you can measure it.
I can only speak to my experience on this as a partner with United Way of the National Capital Area. With all of their schools that they partner with as a community school, they ask us to provide 3 metrics for them on the ABCs, they call them, the academics, behavior, and then they say coursework, which is really grades. And then their model is for our site coordinator to choose 5% of the population recommended through an MTSS type process, where that's the caseload of the site coordinator, and she monitors their attendance, their behavior, and their coursework. So we do have measures that we have to report on that. Now, that is what they require. It's not something that came from any other body that required it from us.
And if I could add, I think our goal here is to have common metrics, right, across no matter who the sponsors are. And so that is the current work that needs to be done, that the committee is currently working on.
So those metrics should have been shared with the school board members that have responsibility for those schools, and they never were. And I would just presume that they should be, so that we know what we're dealing with. And then the crosswalk between what you're trying to do with this versus the framework provided by the federal government and expanded on Title I. That was another question I had.
Just for clarity, Ms. Corbett Sanders, I think what you're saying is that the federal government has certain metrics to measure the effectiveness of a Title I school. You'd like to have that comparator with how we might measure using metrics on the success of the community schools?
Yes, and the Title I actually requires a certain amount of community engagement, requires representation in that, requires details in the school improvement plans, things like that. So those are all well laid out. I'm kind of perplexed that we haven't done that crosswalk here.
Well, what I can say about Title I is you already stated, those are federal requirements that are quite time intensive. And I think, while I was not involved in the site selection process for community schools, and I've not yet been involved in the program evaluation development, what our discussions recently have been is that it's really critical that we establish consensus with this board and the Board of Supervisors around the framework. Because once we have consensus around the framework, we can develop our comprehensive program evaluation plan to measure those elements that Jesse laid out in this presentation. Again, academics, attendance, behavior, social emotional wellness. So we're still at the development stages of that. Again, the committee has begun drafting an evaluation plan, but we still need the FCPS side to weigh in on that and develop that more fully. So it's a work in progress. And, you know, these past several years during the pandemic, I don't think really probably would have been the best time to try to develop an external accountability model for a framework that hadn't even been approved by the 2 boards yet. So I think that's really the thinking at this point.
So I guess my question is, and just bear with me a second, the site selection is actually premature because we don't have a framework. And until we have a framework, we shouldn't be talking about site selection. We need to have a general consensus around this board as the governing body responsible for schools to be able to support that framework.
I think that's right. I do think it is both things, though. That's why we kind of frame those guiding questions of trying to get some input and hopefully some consensus around the framework. If there are things that need to be modified in the framework, you're bringing up some good things that perhaps need to be modified in the framework. We can get that taken care of, and then we can get to, and it'd be good to have some discussion today as well, some additional board input on what that site selection process would look like. Because obviously, we haven't done a good job with that, and we need to improve our communication and collaboration with board members and community members around that. So getting some additional thought and input on the site selection would be good if we can get to it today as well.
Do you have your next question?
No, I'll just go with a go back because I know I've taken up too much time. I would have hoped my questions would have been answered.
Okay, thank you. I have Dr. Anderson, followed by Ms. Omish, and then Laura Jane Cohen, and then Tamara Kovacs.
Thank you so much. I think my initial question was about site selection. I'm a parent at Glasgow Middle School, and so I had no idea that it was a site until that came up not even many, many months ago to us. And just piggybacking a little bit on something that Ms. Keys-Gamarra's shared, as a parent there, I have no idea what that means. It has not been communicated to me what the services that would be available to my child, to other children, would be. So I think that's a key piece that should be there, because right now it's not, and I'm definitely speaking from firsthand experience. But I see where a lot of the gaps are, so I'm not going to belabor the point. So I'm going to try to be helpful in terms of moving forward. I fully agree that we do need to have some criteria in order for this to make sense. And I fully believe that we need to have some evaluation criteria in terms of, once it is at these 3 schools, what is its impact? I appreciate your information, but I'd like to have that be I'd like to nail it down a little bit more. And when I look at the pillars that you all offered on page 9, there were 4 pillars: integrated student supports, expanded enrichment learning, time and opportunities, active family and community engagement, and collaborative leadership and practices. For me, I'm already seeing questions being teased out of that for your evaluation. If these are the pillars, how are these being evaluated so that we know that these pillars are being addressed, in addition to the principles that you shared on page, I can't find it, but there are some principles on some page. Was it again?
Probably the one right before that.
Oh, was it? I was close, but no
Maybe
quite cigar.
it's in there somewhere.
But either way, if we could restructure those into questions, because one of the things I would also like to know is, if these are the principles, this is what's key to the structure of a community school, are these things really happening in the community schools? And if so, to what extent? Because this could very well be a name only. Oh, is my time up? Oh, not quite. This could very well be a name only, but we want to make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck. I do want to say that I think there's a space here when it comes for site selection for us to be a little bit more balanced in terms of just leaning only into, well, there was a funder that was available and we wanted to take opportunity of that, we want to take advantage of that opportunity. I think there has to be a little bit more investment and communication with this board, with the community, because if there's going to be a program in our schools, not only do we want for folks to buy in, but they should also know what does it mean for them. And that's a piece that I sorely see very much missing. So I'm going to stop there and take a breath and hear any feedback that you may have on what I just shared.
I want to take one from both you and Ms. Corbett Sanders and just be candid. I've got 3 months left, right? So I can be super candid, not that I haven't always been. If you can go back to slide 12, the Board of Supervisors and School Board met in 2016. This was another administration when this first priority was made. That's the first thing I want this board to hear. Many of you, the majority of you who only came, 3 months before a pandemic hit. That's why this hasn't been on your agenda for the last 2 years. We had a pandemic. It started in 2016. A new superintendent came. Nobody sat down with me and told me what Skip was. I knew 2 board members were going to the meetings and they would report back to the board. That's just the truth, folks. Nobody told me to put that on the agenda. Even former board members who were in leadership at the time didn't say this needs to be one of the board's priorities, this needs to be on the agenda. That's the truth too. That's the truth. Now, 5 years later, we want to come and throw stones at something that has a national best practice framework that can drive results in schools. And we should be looking at whether this has a fit for Fairfax County. I think it does. But what happened is, and this is what happens sometimes in this county, a lot of good intentions from everybody. The idea greenlit between 2 boards in the middle of a superintendent transition. A new board that here now 2 years in, dominated by a pandemic, doesn't really get to dive into this issue of site selection, which is definitely important. But the pandemic ate up all that time. So now we're just trying to get back and build in partnership with you, what does this board want to do? Veteran board members, new board members, there's some basic bones in here that I think are good. There are gaps. There are gaps. But we do want to partner because I think the journey that these 3 schools have gone on, I want to say even 2 or 3 years ago prior to the pandemic, we even had an open house. I think Ms. McLaughlin got to go to Mount Vernon Woods. We did some board reach out, but we never put it onto the board agenda. I take some responsibility for that. I was superintendent then in 2018. But I didn't question that it wasn't a priority. Dr. Duran came to me and said, hey, we got 2 schools and now we have another funder who wants to come and do a 3rd school. And at the time, with everything else, I'm like, sounds like a no-brainer. We have board members, school board members, and board of supervisors meeting every couple of months. The skip sounds like a big deal. I should have asked more questions. I didn't. I apologize and take responsibility for that. But I do want to say, I think we've got something here that's got a good foundation. The framework we should have developed earlier and not 4 years later. But we've got a good foundation, and I think we can build from here. That's why we paused. We haven't done a single thing more and really want to get your feedback today so that as we go forward, we do it the right way and in that collaborative way that I think, frankly, in the end was just missing when this thing got birthed and then transitioned to a new administration and then just never got on the board's agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Brabrand. Was there anyone else who wanted to respond to my statements?
I can just add the points that you made about what should be included in the evaluation and based on those pillars and the process kind of stuff is right on and is exactly the kinds of stuff that we are looking at. And so I wish we were a little bit further down the road that we could share that today. It's not quite ready yet, but it includes all of those components.
Thank you. I don't want to go back, but I want to finish this one statement. Dr. Brabrand, I appreciate your statements, and I hope this does not come across as throwing stones, but it's an opportunity to reframe what's been going on. We should not throw out the baby with the bathwater on this one, but we just need to recapture and reset. And I think that's what I'm seeing this conversation as. Yes, there are gaps, but it is not too late. Given some of the things that I've read here, probably 10 or 12 of my schools could qualify as community schools. They're high poverty schools, high academic needs schools. I need to be able to discern why this one and not that one. Why Glasgow and not Poe? Why not Holmes? So that's kind of the information that I'm looking for. I see a lot of space for us to restructure and regroup so that whatever decisions Skip is able to recommend, it makes sense to everybody who's looking at the data. That's how I'm coming into this conversation. So I'm happy to serve in whatever way to help shape your evaluation process and your recommendation criteria process. So you can count on me for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I do want to capture both points here. On the one hand, as Dr. Brabrand, you mentioned, the pandemic really put a pause on this. It even put a pause on Skipped meeting for almost an entire year. So, I mean, Skip lost a year of being able to continue this work on community schools. That said, I do really hope that our school staff and our county partners understand a little bit of the intensity I think you're hearing in the room, which I would anticipate you'd hear from the Board of Supervisors too, is when programs and really big operational changes like this happen, and you don't bring it to the elected bodies, especially those where it resides in their districts, it's challenging because this is the way our government's set up. You have elected officials who represent the board, who in the end are the ones who make the directives to the county executive and to the superintendent. And so it's concerning when you hear Dr. Anderson say, not only does she represent Glasgow Middle School, she's a parent in Glasgow Middle School, and she's telling you even to this day, we're not making that connection to our families that she even knows what that means. And this is her community school. So I think everybody's coming at this with good intentions, and the county partners in special know I've been championing this since 2013 when I first learned about them at a national school board conference in San Diego. And so it's a fantastic thing that we're about to embark on with greater intentionality. And I just want to reassure everyone, you know, we did our best as a county institution for taking 3 funding opportunities, 3 pilots. The communication piece definitely fell down from there. Dr. Ivy, you said it best. We don't want to stumble again. So absolutely, there should never be another community school started without the board of supervisors and the school board members knowing first about it. So my colleagues, I know I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So Dr. Anderson, thank you. We're moving on to Ms. Omish, followed by Laura Jane Cohen, Tammy Derna Kofax, and then Rachna Sizemore-Heiser.
Before my turn, just a point of order, Ms. McLaughlin. It seems that we haven't been following decorum, so I don't feel that it's fair to be restricted to my 3 minutes. I'd like to share what I have to share, and you can take it where you want to take it, but just based on what's just happened. Okay, so first, I do want to thank staff, you know, Mr. Ellis, Mr. Leonard, Dr. Herring for coming forward today to share this with us. I think there's a recognition that perhaps there's board turnover over the years, and folks have their thoughts about the history of it, but I also just want to be very clear that this is huge, and this is a really good step in the right direction for our community, for those most vulnerable members of our communities especially. And we know more than ever now this year and the past year that food access is an instructional issue, that health is an instructional issue, mental health is an instructional issue. So these are key partnerships and starting points to get to a place where we can really educate every child. And I'm very grateful for you guys coming forward today. I imagine there are some steps to move forward in professionalizing what this looks like. And I think we're all on the same page with that. And Dr. Presidio in the presentation also shared that there are some growth areas here. So I look forward to getting somewhere constructive in our conversation. So with that, you all were asking a little bit on framework feedback related to that. You know, one thing I thought was a great opportunity, I think Ms. Keys-Gamarra touched on co-location as a possibility, even just thinking of how we plan into the future, whether that's through joint CIP work or how we, you know, include some of that county school system collaboration around facilities and even boundary planning based on what Corbett Sanders raised as a concern of access to the school building, where services are provided. I think that's, you know, number one, there's opportunity there when thinking about spaces. I think number two, this is maybe too complex, but even when we think of businesses or real estate, et cetera, coming to the county, there's potential opportunity to incentivize partnership or put certain stipulations. I think that's something maybe the Planning Commission can explore. I'm not sure exactly where that lives on the county side, but I wanted to flag that as a possible opportunity to expand partnerships. A third area, I think, in how we think of this framework, and I should have said before, I imagine work with the Fairfax Foundation will be key. Also, we have our own, right, team that works on some of these partnerships. I think they have to be a part of this conversation. The next point was when thinking even about, so beyond just maybe backpacks and kind of social services, CTE and opportunities for employment for some of our kids are a huge area where I think we can find opportunity here. What do I mean by that? So we have some schools where kids have to work. They have to work to provide for their families. And so they miss school and they have chronic absenteeism issues. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because, they just got to put food on the table, or they're homeless, or they're the only kid here from their whole family, or whatever it might be, right? So I think that's a place where we can think about even opportunities for SPED or English learner kids with some of those partnerships, and how we work with some of these organizations in facilitating opportunity in those areas. Let's see, what else? So those are some of the framework-related pieces. And I think there was a piece someone mentioned also about listening to the community, identifying need. From what I'm hearing is there's an organization that's reached out. Maybe we do vetting, maybe we don't, I don't know. But then we work with that partner. We can also think of it in the flip way, where we actually survey needs and then seek out partners who, through relationships, whatever, that may serve those needs. So I think that's another way just to reframe and consider how we can expand this further as we move forward. And then just finally, in terms of site selection, a couple of things. COVID actually, in the way that we did school throughout that, gives us some data we wouldn't have otherwise had. For example, I immediately think of which schools had the highest needs for MiFi devices, right, who didn't have internet at home. Maybe that's a factor we can think about as well when we try to develop that queue. Because that's clearly, if a family doesn't have internet, there's likely to be many other gaps in what services they have. So that's another piece. And then I don't know if we relied on need to identify vaccination sites, Dr. Presidio, when we did that originally. Was that related at all? Do you remember?
I don't know. I was not unfortunately involved in that. I'm not sure if we have anybody here who knows the answer to that, but we could follow up with you.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to, if there was already a setup of how we thought about that, it might be useful to reference that as well. And then finally, in terms of availability of public services is something we consider as well. So if a school is located near a public clinic where families may already have access to certain health services, maybe they're not the top priority for a health partnership, right? Maybe another school is. So I think looking at the geography is another key area in determining these pieces, which I don't think is listed. I did read your report and thoroughly try to look at everything. So those are just some ideas. Maybe, I don't know if you guys have responses to some of those pieces, but I really hope we can explore some of them.
I don't know that we have any responses other than to say those are excellent suggestions, all of them, honestly. And we're taking notes over here. A number of us are taking notes, so we appreciate those, and certainly welcome, further conversation with you about it, because those are great ideas.
Great, thank you for your work.
And I would just add that some of what you suggested could fall under the community schools, but some of what you suggested also falls within the general work of Skipt and some of the other committees, particularly the workforce development piece.
Thank you, Ms. Zamesh. I did give you 5 minutes, so I hope you felt good about that. I do need to have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser go because she's got to leave shortly. So my colleagues, I hope you're okay. It will be Ms. Sizemore-Heiser and then Ms. Cohen and then Ms. Dearnach-Kofax.
Thank you, and I'll be quick. I appreciate the indulgence of my colleagues. I will be honest, this being posted Friday night late, I was not able to dig into this at all, anywhere near the level. It's a very lengthy and dense report. So I cannot answer these questions today. I cannot tell you framework, I cannot tell you site selection, we just can't. It just was not, and not a blame, I understand there's a lot going on, but it's very difficult to give guidance, So what I will say is I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this framework in terms of understanding, gives me pause when I see that the coordinator position may or may not be an FCPS employee. That gives me a lot of pause. So I think that I really do appreciate the framing that, Skipt came through. It was off for a year because of the pandemic. You have a new board that really hasn't got a chance to dig into this. This is some great information. You guys have done a lot of really wonderful work in setting up this framework and talk. But to me, site selection, I don't even have the chance to read into the framework to really even ask the question. So I think, I'll be honest, I'm even having trouble following all of what you're saying because of it's pages and pages of information that's dense. And if you haven't been to a Skipt meeting and you haven't been briefed as a board, which we haven't, I'm have worked on community schools. I understand the model. I understand the need. I think it's a great model, and I think it can bring a lot of value to our schools and very needed in our schools, but it is not something that I can really give a lot of feedback on right now. I will say that I think in the framework piece of things, my understanding of community schools was we run our schools, FCPS, and the school board does, and then we have outside organizations that bring in services that people can access. And I think that's the framework that we need to build this around. And it doesn't feel like that's the framework that, again, having not had the chance to really dig into this to the level that I need to and ask the questions over a 3-day weekend of staff that I may have wanted to kind of ask before we got to this place, that doesn't feel like that's what the framework is here. And that's, again, not sure if that's my understanding or the framework that's there. So that'd be my one big overarching feedback is how does this fit within our current structures and framework of our school system that allows for a coordinator to build and manage these partnerships. But when I see the position described as assess assets and needs, develop annual plan, that to me seems to go beyond that role that I was envisioning when I think about community schools and my limited knowledge of community schools. So that's, I guess, my overarching. As far as site selection, I do think it needs to be based a little bit on what lessons learned from the current schools that we have in terms of where we see the needs and the effectiveness, and then the clear criteria around site selection. But that's, again, very, in my opinion, a very high level feedback to you all. I very strongly believe in community schools. I think it can do some really, really good in FCPS, but I don't know if we're there yet as a board to be able to give you great feedback.
Yes, thank you, Rachna. Mr. Leonard?
Yes, thank you, Megan. And I just wanted to jump in, Madam Vice Chair, and say that what you just captured, with the feedback we're here collecting today, what you just captured was kind of where we were in 2018. There's not many of us that were here in 2018, but we got to your predecessors on this school board, and we realized we needed to hit the brakes because everything was going too fast. We had 3 that were primarily done. You know, we were really focused on the 2. The one that's at Glasgow kind of came out of our purview, right? So all of those were kind of part of opportunities that nobody wanted to miss. So we jumped in there. This is an effort to kind of get us to a place where the school board can be comfortable with what the future of community schools looks like. So nobody's talking about funding or site selection or any of that until we get to a point where the school board is comfortable with what this looks like moving forward. Because I can tell you that I can remember the day that I was on the phone with Francisco, and there was a lot that were going on there, and I said, let's hit the brakes. Nobody needs to do anything right now. And then, then 2020, everybody hit the brakes, obviously. But with regards to what we're doing here, I think this is a really good start, right? So we needed something for you to react to. So this is really good for you to be able to react and give us that feedback. And certainly take your time, and nobody's doing anything. We're not in a rush. So we're going to do this right. And this is part of doing it right moving forward. You've got all the partners here lined up that are ready to work together, but we want to make sure that this works for the school board first, and then we'll expand upon that.
I guess just briefly, all I'm saying is I don't even know whether it works or not because I haven't had the time to dig into this material. That's, I think, where I'm trying to come from. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think you captured it extremely well, and I'm sure it was reassuring for all of the board members to hear that. Ms. Cohen, are you up and ready to join us?
Yes, I'm driving, but I am very happy to get a chance just to give some feedback. I think a piece of this, and Scott says the slow down to go fast piece, and I understand the frustration in that because I think some of us have principals who have been really eager to become community schools and haven't known the process, haven't known who to even advocate to make that happen. And I think the pandemic, just like everything, has really laid bare for a lot of those schools, even more than they already had, just a real gap of where they need to, just how central they are in the community, which I sort of think is kind of the idea behind community schools. So my advocacy would definitely be having the principals, involved and educating them about the process and how their voice can be heard. Another piece, just like when we had the conversation this morning about ESSER, is I just wanted to make sure that mobility and homelessness are a piece of the conversations that we're having about community schools. Is that represented? Did I just miss that?
It is a part of both of those are, yes, a part of the selection criteria.
Awesome. And then the last thing I just wanted to highlight, and Ms. Keys-Gamarra certainly started to speak to this piece of location being really important and just collaboration generally. I will say that I've definitely heard back from some families that our need as a county to now close libraries on Sunday means a lot of kids who use that as a resource to be able to have a safe place to do homework and a place with good, reliable Wi-Fi, that went out the window. So now they've only got one weekend day where they do that. So even the conversations, I think, around that, certainly that's not something where coordinating with the schools would come to mind when you're trying to figure out, when to close libraries and how to work with the Great Resignation and staffing shortages and all of that. But I think those are exactly the kinds of conversations that we need to be having together, even outside of community schools, is how do we further collaborate as a county that really lifts up and supports our kids who are struggling. And we certainly saw that data. I know many people have referenced it, and I've appreciated their reference this morning with our conversations about ESSER. I think this goes hand in hand with those conversations.
Well said, Ms. Cohen, and you had 19 seconds left. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I'm gonna let Tammy Derenak Kofax, who's definitely more of an expert on community schools than I am, use my 19 seconds.
There you go. Okay, great. Ms. Derenak Kofax?
Yes, ma'am. I want to thank everybody for being here today. This, as Ms. McLaughlin and so many of us have referenced, this is an excellent concept that can and should be executed in Fairfax County. But I do appreciate you, Chris, saying we needed to put the brakes on when it first started, because I was in that room. I was the person that helped start Skip. I was one of those people. And a couple things. Respectfully, Dr. Brabrand, I talked to you about this at length, Dr. Brabrand, about how Skipped was kind of going off course from where it was originated, which was pre-K and social justice, into all of these, juvenile justice, I should say, into all these other areas. And particularly as I sat there in a meeting where staff, I believe under you, Dr. Brabrand, had stated that this is the way these community schools, this is done. I had to go and sidebar with United Way out in the hallway, because explaining to them my frustration. So that history needs to be told and needs to be understood and not brushed under the rug. And that's why there's the frustration from those of us who are here who feel like this might be Groundhog Day, where we're being asked to make decisions again where we don't have enough information on, number one, where is the data from the pilots? I realize that we've had COVID, but we still need some kind of measurement and to see how we came up with that. Also, we just talked at great length about the social and emotional learning, and I realize the ESSER funds are one-time funds, but how, when we go through that process, how will the ESSER funds be, the results of the ESSER funding, how will that help with change what the school needs are? How is this program going to be intertwined with what Mark Greenfelder does? How will this be intertwined? How will the RASs work with this? But when you talk about the basic structure, how will we choose the schools? I want to be able to choose them in conjunction with your team of professionals, but not being given it at a meeting the way it was given the first time around. So that's the frustration. We must change that. We must jointly come up with criteria, our board as the policymakers with your staff, to make sure, and county staff, Jesse and his team, and all of those who work, whose heart is in the right place, but may be perplexed as to why we are frustrated again with what is happening. So those are comments. I don't even know if I have any questions at this point, but I would like to say, Dr. Presidio, from your perspective, have you talked, and Dr. Ivy, have you talked with the Razes and their teams as to right now which schools? Because I would say, the two that were kind of on the initiation there, Lynbrook and Hybla Valley, those are some of my schools. Yes, they're high FRM, but they are some of the ones that have some of the most engaged parent teams. What about those who have more mobility, less engaged families? All of these things need to be talked about, and then we can talk about the criteria. But it's almost like you have to bring us that data rather than just bring us based upon FRM alone. So any comments to any of that I said?
Well, just similar to what Mr. Leonard said earlier, we've not been engaging in conversations around particular sites until the board is really comfortable with the framework for what we're doing with community schools. So we haven't done that. But what we did want to do was put some initial thinking on the table for this board to consider as a starting point in terms of obviously A, the framework, and then B, some criteria around a site selection process. No intent to say that this is what it is, this is what it has to be, but really to start the conversation with the board.
So well, in the 30-page document, there were, and it did say, potential or just an example. But I think, when that comes out there, then you think that that's next on, particularly with the lack of fidelity that was shown the first time around. So I want to go back to saying, I think this is a model that we see that works, but we're not sure how it's going to work here in Fairfax County. One thing I might consider is saying, let's get through the superintendent search while you all work on potential ways for us to move forward, see what ESSER brings us, and then come back and work with the school board as the policymakers to say, okay, this is what we can agree to, and then take it back to Skipt. And I do have a question just directly for Jesse on this. Is there, it's not actually on this, but it's because I've stepped off of Skipt. Is the pre-K conversation still coming up with regularity, and where are we on that?
Yes, school readiness is still a major priority issue for the Skipt, and the Skipt is helping guide and provide support to the implementation of the Equitable School Readiness Strategic Plan, which is basically all of the strategies that we are trying to move forward. There's a lot of stuff that's going on along with that as well. But yeah, that is definitely a major priority area for the Skipt.
I appreciate that, Jesse. And I know that, sorry, I'm using my iPad. I know that you all have been working hard on that, but I hear the waiting list is growing again. And this is, to me, that is something that needs to be addressed as well. And that should be a priority as well, and how we can work on that together in tandem with these community schools, adding pre-K to the list, because some of these issues that are there, we all know if you catch them early, they're not issues as much. So thank you, Ms. McLaughlin, for giving me my extra time here for my many years on Skipt and the history behind kind of where we are today. Thank you.
No worries. Like Ms. Omish, I thought it'd be good for you to get your 5 minutes in. So I have Ms. Pekarsky and then Ms. Tolan on the list.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for being here today. I was on the Skipt when it finally started up again, and left before we really got too much into this. So I appreciate this. I guess it's good that I'm following Ms. Derenak Kofax, because what I'm struggling is to kind of get a handle, the lines between the roles of this board, our school system, the site coordinator, and how that works. And maybe you could speak to that. Our school staff are our experts in the needs of our schools and what our students have, their communities. But in this process, when you look at the site selection, principals and teachers they're not even part of the conversation until after the site selections have been made. So am I wrong? Number one, that's how I understood it.
No, they would be part of that second phase. So there's kind of the initial, let's take the 180 schools, narrow that down to a more manageable list, then engage with schools and other stakeholders to assess some of those more qualitative components, and then be able to prioritize a list based on that. So yes, principals, other key stakeholders, including the boards, would be involved before we finalize any lists.
We need to include teachers. If this is coming to a school,
Yes.
all of those pieces, are they prepared? And then I guess, what is the interaction? How does it work between our school administrators that our superintendent hires and, you have to answer to, and the site coordinator that is an outside entity?
So thank you. I almost jumped in when Ms. Sizemore Heiser asked that question. No. It's really a partnership, and honestly, the principal has final say. If the site coordinator has an idea for something, we talk about it as a whole leadership team with that site coordinator as part of that discussion. And then we decide as a team, with the final word is the principal, does that fit the mission and vision of both the school, what we know our community to be, and what our superintendent and regions have set out for us. So it's not like a rogue going around, we're gonna do this. I really wanna just speak up for the schools, and I know it's personal to me because I've been living it. We were kind of given some great resources and then almost asked a little bit to figure it out along the way. And I want to give credit to Mount Vernon Woods and to Whitman and my staff and how much it really has improved our school. It's not the measurable outcomes that I think it needs, but there's been a lot of good work done over the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic. And it rallied the teachers around us being a community school, at least in my experience. So just so you know, it really is a partnership. We work with both United Community and United Way International Capital Area to talk about what we want to try to accomplish. So just, rest assured, that's been the model, at least at, I know, Mount Vernon Woods and Whitman.
Yeah, that's really helpful because, like most people, I think, on the board, we just don't have a lot of knowledge as to what this looks like when you go beyond, the on paper and have to put it in practice and operationalize it. So, I would be open and as we go on with this conversation and maybe having some of the administrators or even teachers from these schools to kind of give us their insight, the things that have worked well and haven't. I think that would help me while we're talking about making these decisions, and while we're working on the criteria and looking at the data, which I think we have to have measurable, goals for these schools. So I guess that's where I am, super high level. I have not had the opportunity to dive into this just because of when it was posted. And I look forward to doing so, and I am excited. I do think this is great opportunity. I'm supportive, and it's wonderful to hear that it has brought so many positives to school communities. And now I think the details is kind of where we need to hone in and work through. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, I just have a couple of things, and then I'm going to close us out. We have some time constraints. It's a little bit after 4 already. So I would just kind of like to pull things together. You know, I'm new on Skipt, just a couple of months, but I do have, you know, I represent Drainsville, and I've got a number of schools in Herndon, for example. Just having some discussions with people at the schools and with my regional assistant superintendent that I think could really gain a lot from this type of activity. I've also been active with our, you know, Herndon, you know, Opportunity Neighborhood, the school readiness team. And when I just see all of these various resources that are out there in the community, you know, that I've spent a career building strategic collaborations and partnerships and putting programs together. And I just see this as, you know, an incredible opportunity to do that. So, you know, we may have had our hiccups along the way, you know, through the past. You know, I was hoping maybe to hear a little bit more from Dr. Herring today about, you know, what's actually happening on the ground at his school. But I appreciate Stella's comment that, you know, maybe that's another whole conversation that we need to have with all 3 of the schools and the staff of the schools. You know, what's really worked, whether it's exactly measurable or not. You know, what are these opportunities that we could potentially take advantage of, you know, moving forward. So I think, you know, moving forward here, Ms. McLaughlin and I, as the, you know, just 2 school board members right now in Skipt, you know, we'll take it forward and come up with a plan for, you know, maybe, as we've talked, a number of us about, you know, working on taking the comments we've gotten today, putting, you know, some more questions or some ideas around the framework, or, you know, how do we move forward to get more meat around the framework, change it, get more information, is the next step after that, site selection, et cetera. But just to work with the team that we have and figure out how we move forward and when we come back to the board and how we come back to the board with more information.
Well,
So,
I do want to just add what I think is important that I heard from board members is we really haven't even had a chance for our superintendent and the leadership team to do their, you know, expert recommendations to us. Like, it's here, but this came out of the subcommittee on community schools. Skipt endorsed it. But, I mean, we're about to have a new superintendent, and with a veteran superintendent here and his team, we really need for them to kind of say to the board, here's what we've heard from our principals who are running the pilots, and here's how we would recommend refining it. So Ms. Tola and I talked about that. Number one, if we could get some of our staff analysis on what they'd recommend to the board that we consider. Number two, that board members who would like to have 2x2s to have a deeper dialogue on this with the appropriate team members for this. And then number three, that we would refer this back to the Skipt Executive Committee. You know, that's really where we get a chance to talk with senior leadership on the county government, senior leadership on the school side, which includes Dr. Presidio and Dr. Francis or Ivy, and also Dr. Michelle Boyd. So we end up getting this, the full board, that staff analysis. We end up having that senior conversation. I think we can map out to what Chris Leonard shared with us is kind of that next step. And I really appreciate, Chris, you and Jesse, you know, coming over, spending this time with us, all the background work you did in advance of it. But most importantly, I felt you really communicated a sense of partnership of, look, we get you guys in the end, you own the schools, and if we got to get you comfortable with it in order to really embark on this incredible direction that I think we do need to take our schools. So, Ms. Corbett-Sanders?
Any framework that we're talking about, there has to be a clearly defined role.
yes.
Certain obligations. The other piece of it, so that clearly defined role, you know, for example, we heard about the collaboration and how United Way has had an input into what's happening in schools, which is great, except that conversation should have come to the board members who have responsibility in that area. And so I would just urge that any framework clearly defines roles and responsibilities and honors the role of the school board. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mr. Leonard, as Deputy County Executive, is there anything else you want to say before we close the meeting?
Partnership remains strong, remains strong. We all know this is, I grew up with educators. My parents were educators. Wife's an educator. Oldest daughter's an educator. My dad used to say all the time, the 17 outside the school directly drives the 7 hours in the school. So I've always kind of had that concept, and I know Jesse and I have talked about it. So we believe in that. 17 hours does make an impact on that 7 inside the school. So we remain ready to partner with you and do it right this time and make sure that you're fully comfortable before we move forward.
Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, board members. We're adjourned. No, look at you. Applause from the superintendent.
I know.